Good evening, and welcome to the 9th episode of the Political Mike podcast. I have with me two very intelligent young men. They are, I'm just excited. I feel like we have three political nerds tonight. They're going to just break it down. I've got Mr. Ethan Kelly and Ryan Gest. Ethan Kelly's from Let's Talk Elections. This is a YouTube channel, and also they have an Instagram and social media presence. And they, like Elections Prediction Official with Mr. Ryan Gest, do election polling data. And they're very accurate. I've been following them before the 2018 midterms, and I can attest to their accuracy and their predictions and their calculations of the socioeconomic and also political demographics that come into play that affect what we see on election day. So let's not waste any more time. I have so much to talk about, so little time, but I want to go ahead and continue where we started off last week, which was dealing with the situation in Kenosha, Wisconsin. Of course, this is, even though we seem a little far removed with the Bob Woodward book, the Trump comments on the military, social unrest still seems to be prevalent in that state. Ethan, what have you seen in your polling data, and specifically in Wisconsin, key battleground state? DNC was supposed to be held there before COVID-19 made it virtual. What are you seeing that indicates that Trump or Biden have an edge in that state? Trump, of course, harping on this law and order message. Biden, of course, releasing an ad last week that calls for specific policy changes, particularly when it comes down to police interactions with folks of color. What are you seeing?
So it's kind of tricky. Wisconsin's a very weird state. I will say that it definitely is expected to go to Biden at this point. And I honestly don't think that a lot of the civil unrest in Wisconsin is changing the voting patterns that I've seen too much. From what I've seen from 2 years ago to a year ago to last month to literally yesterday, Wisconsin hasn't varied too much. They've always been, pro-Biden. I think that a lot of what he's done with the Obama administration is going to resonate very well with those voters. And I think this, idea that Trump has bounced back in Wisconsin is just a false narrative. Right. He's moved up. Trump has moved up marginally. I mean, we're talking 1-2%, and then it returns back to being a Biden lead. And from what I've seen in Wisconsin is that, first of all, like the electorate across the Rust Belt has stayed the same for the past 2 years. They've been, voting for Democrats in the midterm elections. And what we've seen now is that it's probably not going to change too dramatically in this election. So I think Biden's still up. I don't think that the law and order message is going to resonate too well with a lot of these voters. And the main reason why Clinton lost the state was in decreased, black turnout, which is something I don't think that Biden will have too big of an issue with in Wisconsin or across the country at all.
Ryan, what are you seeing? Because, I keep hearing, hey, don't get excited, because just like in 1988, when you had the Democratic candidate at the time, Dukakis, he had a strong lead against George H.W. Bush in the summer. And all of a sudden, the Willie Horton ad comes out, the law and order message comes out, and the Republicans they win big time. It's a landslide by November. And then the conversation switches to how the Democrats can actually remain a viable party after. Of course, we know 92 happened. But what are you seeing? Do you see any parallels between 1988 and this year? I know, there's a lot of folks who have made up their mind already. I think that may be a key difference. But are you seeing anything in your polling that indicates otherwise?
Well, to talk about the whole people have made up their mind earlier is what we're seeing in a lot of national head-to-head polls between Biden and Trump. Specifically, there's a lot less undecided voters overall than there was even in 2016 at this point in time. And then if we're to talk about Wisconsin specifically, if I could share my screen real quick. Still need to figure out exactly how to do this. But
go ahead and click the bottom, share screen. Okay, so hopefully he'll come back real quick. But Ethan, if you could pick up where he left off.
I guess so. In talking about when you mentioned undecided voters, they were crucial to Trump's victory in Wisconsin 4 years ago. Pretty much what polling missed was the fact that Hillary Clinton, it got it right on target, actually, that she was right under 50%. So when he was talking about undecided voters, it's really important to note that there aren't as many by any stretch of the imagination at this point.
Apologies for that. For some
Oh,
reason,
no.
I got kicked off when I tried to share my screen, which is strange.
Okay.
But basically,
Do you see?
yeah, but basically what I was trying to say is that since late August, so August 24th or August 27th, 26th specifically, Biden was plus 5.9 in Wisconsin, and now he's plus over 7. So if anything, what we've seen in Wisconsin specifically, not like at a national scale, but there hasn't been much of a negative drawback towards Biden for everything that happened. And if anything, it's actually helped him specifically in that state, whereas obviously in national polling, we've seen a little bit of a tightened race overall. But then again, there's all that talk about whether or not that's just a post-RNC bump and whether or not that's starting to come back down to earth, at least for Trump's numbers.
Right. And I think in one of your videos, Ryan, you had pointed out that Florida is the most important state in this election. Now, there's been a lot of talk about not taking the Rust Belt for granted, specifically Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan. But Florida, is still a game changer because whoever wins Florida seems to have, like you pointed out, an easier time for the rest of the evening. Could you elaborate on that a little bit?
Well, one thing I wanted to sort of stress, in at least in that video about Florida, was the fact that they're one of these states with the longest lasting history of mail-in voting in general. And then obviously in years past, what we've seen is, at least in 2012 and 2016, is the mail-in voting takes up a huge chunk of the overall vote. And then we see that come into play on election night in the coverage early on. And then we see that counted, and then the in-person vote starts to get counted on top of that. And so that's completely different than in other states where we see the in-person vote come in first, and then we get all the mail-in vote coming in afterwards. So the one thing about Florida that I wanted to stress was that they begin counting mail-in votes 22 days before the election, which is a full 3 weeks. And that's, I think they're one of the only battleground states, as you would call them, that actually does do that early. And so what I'm saying is, on election night, we're going to see Florida probably be one of the only key states that could get a projection on that night. And thus, whatever happens there is going to tell us a whole lot about what polling accuracy has been like throughout this entire cycle.
That's a good point. And Ethan, you actually scared me a little bit earlier this week when you showed a scenario where it was a map of, like, it was a sea of red. And, that was after you explained that election night most likely look very red because the folks who would go in person to vote typically vote Republican. But the folks who would send mail-in ballot votes, which would be counted probably days after, they're the ones that typically lean Democratic. If you can, I'm excited to see if, the viewers would want to see this. If you could share your screen just to show that scenario would look like if on election night we're seeing a very Republican, seemingly a Republican map.
Red Mirage is what it's called, I think, right? Was that the term that the Bloomberg group called it, I think?
Yeah. Okay, so you can see my screen, right? All good. Okay, great. So essentially, we're talking about what would happen on election night. Is that what we see across the country is that generally we will see Republicans turn out to the polls in larger rates than Democrats. A lot of Democrats are going to want to vote by mail just because there's been a very clear difference between, Republican handling of the COVID-19 situation versus Democrat handling. I honestly think that since we are one of the only countries that actually politicizes something like this, we're going to see a very clear difference even in traditionally Democratic states. So what we've seen from the Bloomberg, I think actually not just Bloomberg, but a number of other news sources have talked about how, looking at a lot of these states, including, like I said, Democratic states, we could see possibly, New Mexico and Nevada considered to be Republican states on election night, which would just set the precedent, I think, for President Trump to, I made this point in my video, but make the election seem illegitimate. I think that a lot of what we talk about now is how President Trump may or may not accept the election results. And I think this just amplifies it. I think this will probably be something worse than the 2000 election, except at this point, people will be counting votes a week later, and then people will question whether or not if Joe Biden wins or Donald Trump was actually elected president. And honestly, that could go on for the next 4 years and be something that's discussed. Even my home state of Maryland was expected to go red on election night, despite this being a solid Democratic state. I mean, I know it very well, and there's no way Trump could win here, but It's just the reality that a lot of Republicans are going to be voting in person. And if states aren't accustomed to half of their citizens, or maybe even more than half, voting by mail, it's going to be very difficult for them to adjust for that. And on election night, some states have laws where they're not allowed to count ballots before election night, which is going to make it very difficult if they're very heavy, population-wise, and trying to get everything done. So you're pretty much going to see, a lot of states will be called for the Democrats and probably still will have Democrats leading. But this is, roughly a good idea of what we might see on election night, talking about, who's leading in what state versus, who's not.
So while this map is still on, I'm interested in certain states where there seems to be a legitimate shot for the Democrats to take the Senate. Arizona comes to mind. Colorado, of course, when you have Cory Gardner going against John Hickenlooper. You got Georgia. I just moved to Georgia a few weeks ago, and I've been seeing the ads. John Ossoff going up against David Perdue. And then with Georgia, you actually have two Senate seats that are open because Johnny Isakson is retiring. So you've got Raphael Warnock running for that seat. So a lot of, states that would be traditionally safe for Republicans seem to be a little, Georgia seems like to be the only state where there's actually more security on the Republican side to win. Do you think that, this coupled with the fact that, just today, how Senate Democrats and Senate Republicans did not come to an agreement with another COVID relief bill. I think the Democrats wanted 3.1 trillion, and the GOP had what was dubbed a skinny bill, where they actually proposed $1 trillion for COVID relief. Do you think that the fact that there has been no significant COVID relief effort, do you think that will play a role not just on the presidential level but on the Senate levels when we're looking at these states on an individual basis?
So, Ryan, okay. Really quickly, I would just say that a lot of things happen every election season, and I don't think that, parties can't agree on something important is a new idea to American voters. So I don't think that'll be something you can't really blame. I mean, you could, but you can't at the same time. You can't blame parties for not agreeing on things that they're drastically differing on. So I don't think that will make too big of an impact. I just think that what the Democrats are doing is what is making the states competitive. The outreach, the fielding very strong candidates. It's what is making states like Georgia competitive, not so much the failure to pass things in Congress.
Right. I think if there is one state that's seeing sort of an effect from the entire pandemic, it's Arizona, just because of the unpopularity of their governor and his reaction to the entire pandemic itself throughout the entire time that, or since March, really, his approval numbers have plummeted. And thus we've seen polling for Mark Kelly against Martha McSally, obviously, in the Senate race there. And even in the presidential race, we have Biden leading by, I think, +5 now in Arizona. I think he was only +3 a few weeks ago. So we're definitely seeing a shift in Arizona, if there's one specific state to point out, towards the Democrats overall, and specifically because of the pandemic and the Republican response to it.
So I want to, shift the conversation a little bit to, more recent news. Of course, I thought it was interesting that, the Atlantic report that came out last week came so close to the anniversary of 9/11, pertaining to what was allegedly Trump's comments on the military. And, a lot of folks are not, at least from the polling that I'm looking at, thinking about the military factor in this election. There are folks who are overseas who are military personnel, and their votes, they engage in a mail-in ballot on a regular election basis. Do you see that, the potential for the backlash for this, report could have a detrimental effect on the electoral chances of Trump, and not just Trump, but, down ballot?
Yeah. So what we've seen so far is that based off the 2016 numbers, Trump has not improved amongst military voters. Despite this election, it's very much a police versus minorities type election, if I could put it plainly. And I think the military has been grouped in with that. And, in an election where you would see firm opposition to the police force from certain wings of the Democratic Party, you would expect the military vote to drastically shift in favor of Donald Trump. But what we've seen is that, even before these comments, his numbers haven't done well. I mean, I made a video about this 2-3 weeks ago, talking about the military vote, actually around a week ago, before these comments have been released. I mean, this was before people could even involve themselves in that. And it actually showed Biden and Trump neck and neck amongst military voters. And I think this is like a very good showing of what the anti-Trump Republican vote might be like in 2020. These military voters may not have supported Trump wholeheartedly in 2016, but they voted for him because they didn't want Hillary Clinton. And I think there are a lot of military members that see what Trump says as blatant disrespect for the armed forces and say, you know what, I don't like Joe Biden, but I'll vote for him. I hated Hillary Clinton, but I don't like Joe Biden. So a lot of these voters that were, pushing Hillary Clinton away to the farthest part of the country and didn't want to vote for her, wouldn't even consider it, would rather not vote than, vote for Clinton, are starting to accept the idea of voting for Biden. And what we've seen is that has significantly narrowed up, I think 8% difference between Trump's 2016 support amongst military voters and his 2020 support. So.
Ryan?
Yeah, I mean, I think expanding on two of those points with the Atlantic article itself, right around now is usually the time when we start to see all these stories get leaked on the media or by the media that attacks or shows controversy around different candidates. I believe sometime around this time last cycle was when the Hollywood Access tapes released. And obviously they didn't have anywhere near as much of an effect as we thought they were going to. But then again, as Ethan brought up the point that Hillary was hated a whole lot more than Joe Biden ever was. Joe Biden is obviously not incredibly favorable in most polls, but he's not anywhere near as unfavorable as Hillary Clinton ever was. So will these kinds of stories that get leaked about Donald Trump and obviously about his character and his flaws, will they have a bigger impact on the electorate this time around now that people don't hate Joe Biden as much as they did hate Hillary Clinton?
And so I'm curious because, Joe Biden, I thought, I was an early supporter of his before he got into the race. And the idea behind that was, he's going to give Trump the hardest time during the general election season. Now, there seems to be a shift in gears from the Biden campaign, from the way they operated in the primary season and the way they're operating in the general election. And I mean that in terms of, they're very more calculated. The ads are very more closely mirroring, I would think, the Lincoln Project ads in terms of hitting the nail on the head. They're getting more fine-tuned with their message, I believe. What is it? Because Trump has made some kinds of efforts to try to win back those suburban, Caucasian women vote with the tweets he made a few weeks back, with the move of revoking that Obama-era policy that was aimed at diversifying suburban communities. Has those efforts done anything to improve his chances? And polling aside, I also want to get your, personal take on whether you think that's going to be successful, because a lot of folks are saying, hey, the polls lied to me last time, and I'm a little bit more skeptical. Why should I trust the polls this time around? What if the pollsters miss a key demographic? What if the silent, voter is active like they were in 2016?
Yeah, so what we've seen from the 2016 election is that the data actually wasn't too far off from the real results. I think this entire notion that the polls were wrong in 2016, it's not true. They calculated for some error. And yes, they did have Hillary Clinton up, but by 1.9%. And 538 released an article on election day saying all Trump needs is a minimal improvement off the polls to win the election. And I think it was a very different thing when the media was saying Clinton's making, Kansas competitive. That was very different than what the polls were actually suggesting. The polls had indicated Clinton would only win, get over the 270 mark by 2 electoral votes. And only 4 states were wrong, one of which was actually expected to go to Trump. And all of them, except for one, was within the margin of error. So I think that the polls were pretty accurate in 2016. But for people to, look at the polls now and say they don't trust them, I mean, the methodologies have changed. The way that they've approached the polls have changed. It's gotten a lot more accurate. They've had 4 years to adjust. And they were fairly accurate in 2018. So they've already had an election to cover and get right. And I think that's in itself is enough to trust the data in 2020.
Right. And what I've never understood is there's no incentive to get the polls wrong. There's no incentive to favor the Democrats over the Republicans if you're coming at it from all polls are in favor of the Democrats because it's systematically so. There's no reason to do that. If you actually want to drive more support and drive more donations or fundraising for a candidate, you'd show them behind by a certain or lower amount. But the other thing was you spoke about methodology and specifically 538. What 538 did with their forecast in 2016 is completely different than how they're doing it now. In 2016, they went completely off polls, and no other accounted. They didn't account for any type of historical results, any type of turnout effects or anything, which is what they're doing in 2020. So we're obviously seeing a whole lot different of a look in the 538 forecast this year than in 2016.
I want to show my screen, actually. This is a map, and of course I'm using the NBC interactive map, but I remember when, Ethan, when we were still in the process of, speculating who Biden will choose for his vice president, I'm sorry. We were considering, a lot of different candidates, Gretchen Whitmer, Kamala Harris, the Congresswoman Val Demings, I'm sorry. And so it seemed as if Kamala Harris was the favorite among polling. I'm sorry, Elizabeth Warren was the favorite among polling. My personal favorite was Elizabeth Warren. But Ethan, you actually made the point that Kamala Harris could actually help Joe Biden in the Rust Belt. And I was interested if you could, just share why do you think that is?
So when we look at the Rust Belt demographics, it's a very white area. I think this is a good representation of how the American electorate is comprised of majority white Americans. And in a lot of swing states, we see a very large minority population. Look at Georgia, Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado. But in the Rust Belt, we're talking about white working class voters that you would expect to be Republican voters that just aren't. And they're swing voters and they move back and forth. And I think Kamala Harris helps in the sense that she will help drive, Black turnout across this country. And while some people, young people, may not have been too excited about her being the nominee, there are plenty of people outside of, Twitter and YouTube that were very happy with her being the nominee. And I think it was very crucial, very important that the Biden campaign recognized that now more than ever, there needs to be a person of color in the White House. And Elizabeth Warren may have been polling the best amongst Democratic voters, but also Democratic voters are majority white. Some people may not understand the very real need for a lot of these people that, a lot of things about the election is optics. When you have someone who has personally gone through the experiences of racism, someone who could be an advocate in the White House, I think that will definitely help in terms of driving out, African-American turnout across the Rust Belt. 11,000 votes in Michigan could have made a difference, 22,000 in Wisconsin, 44,000 in Pennsylvania. And when you look at the amount of, Black voters that are registered to vote that didn't vote, if they had voted, it would have been a Hillary Clinton presidency. We would be talking about how she could be winning re-election, not about how Trump could win. And I think that is something that the Biden campaign, like I said, really needs to hone in on. The Obama campaign did it beautifully, and the Clinton campaign did not. There was a 7% decrease in Black turnout from 2012 to 2016, and Biden needs to do everything he can to return to those numbers. A win is a win. Doesn't matter the margin. He needs to get there first.
Ryan?
Yeah, it's interesting you make the point about obviously the Democratic electorate and then making sort of the comparison to obviously not all Democrats are on Twitter. And I think that's one interesting thing, that sort of balancing the opinion of the Twitterverse and the actual Democratic electorate, because the overwhelming majority of the Democratic electorate does not get their news from Twitter or use Twitter. The overwhelming majority of the Democratic electorate looks just like and is socially, financially just like the Republican electorate. Like there isn't that much of a difference between the two. So it's interesting sort of just balancing the opinions of obviously the more far left Bernie supporter progressives wing of the party, which were obviously campaigning more for Elizabeth Warren or like Anina Turner, for example. But obviously realizing that there is a significant chunk of the Democratic electorate that is completely separate from that sort of progressive wing. The overwhelming majority of the Democratic electorate voted for Joe Biden for a reason, because the majority of them are moderate and they support his policies and his chances of beating Donald Trump. And that was clearly what happened in South Carolina. In Florida, for example, he won in every single county in Florida. because of obviously this sort of collective desire in the Democratic Party to defeat Donald Trump. And that is their number one priority. And that's what we saw in the primaries.
Yeah, and there seems to be so much more unity, to your point, Ryan, than in 2016. Because I remember, there was still folks who were heavily supporting Bernie Sanders who were just determined not to vote or even switch their vote to Trump. And it was interesting that they, may have seemed to be completely ideologically opposed or diametrically opposite to Trump voters, but it was as if that was their second choice. But I want to turn our attention to this map that I have. This is my prediction based on polling and based on my personal feelings as to how things will play out between now and the next 55 days. This differs from the 2016 poll a little bit in that Arizona is not red, and it seems as if with Kristen Sinema polling behind Mark Kelly, and as you pointed out, the popularity of the governor seems to be a little bit underwater right now. It seems as if that's a state that's going in the direction that the Democrats would like it to go. Florida, it's very difficult. This was the hardest state I had, in terms of predictions. But the latest polling showing 48% to 48% made me feel as if if it's this close within the margin, and the polling seems to show an upward trajectory for the Democrats, and more stagnant trajectory for the Republicans. I said, well, maybe this one will be a little bit blue, but of course that's hopeful thinking. Ohio was interesting because, of course, this is the saying, as Ohio goes, so goes the nation. Ohio was a key player 4 years ago. Of course, the Republicans had their 2016 convention there in Cleveland. This time around, it seems as if pollsters and pundits seem to kind of concede Ohio going in that direction. And I want to get your thoughts on that. And also want to get your thoughts on Pennsylvania. It seems like there's more focus on Pennsylvania and Michigan this time around. Biden, of course, yesterday visited the auto industry in Michigan. I think the Ford dealership or Ford plant, reminding the voters, hey, me and Barack Obama saved your job. Reminding them of the auto bailout of 2009, 2010. Do you think that, coupled with his message of, being on the side for collective bargaining, for unions, would play well in those states? Or do you think that Trump has a solid grip in those regions?
When I think about the state of Ohio, 60 years of being right, why this election, right? And then you look at other states that have always been bellwethers. Missouri, for example, was wrong for the first time, I think, since 1904, was only wrong once in the 50s. And then 2008 rolls around and it goes to McCain. And, 2012, they're like, okay, maybe it'll return. And they don't call it up until when they call, Ohio, even though Missouri went to Romney by 9%. And then we're looking at Ohio in 2016. Trump won that state by nearly 9%, which I think is just insane. The Hillary Clinton vote, she outperformed her polls by 1%, but then, Trump did it by 6%. And he did so well in that state that honestly, I don't think there's going to be a return for the Democratic Party in that state. What 2018 showed us is that even with a lackluster candidate on the Republican side, and what we've seen with, Governor Mike DeWine, as much as he's popular now, he wasn't poised to win on election day in 2018. It was very difficult to draw the conclusion that, even in a wave year, the Democratic Party did okay. They won their Senate race with literally someone who stopped campaigning for months, and against someone who stopped campaigning for months by only 5%. And that was a race that was practically given up from the start. And not only in Ohio, but Florida. Florida's hugely immune to wave years. I mean, in an environment where the Democrats up 8% nationwide, Florida's only up for Biden by 1-2% at most. And Florida really should be moving the same way as the rest of the swing states. Arizona's Biden +5, Colorado's Biden +10, the Rust Belt's Biden +6, 7, 8. So Florida, stays away from the overall wave year. 2018 showed us that. They flipped the Senate on the GOP side, retained it for the governor's mansion. So for both Florida and Ohio, I think that the Democratic Party is definitely at a weaker point there than they are in any other state, any of the other states. And it's very possible that North Carolina goes blue while Florida goes red, and Arizona goes blue while Florida goes red. Florida's just very weird, but that's Florida. So,
I think that all points towards the shift in the geographic electorate of the Democratic and Republican parties, because you're seeing in the Rust Belt, obviously, a big shift towards the Republican Party, while down in the Sun Belt, you're seeing a huge shift towards the Democratic Party. and that is 100% based on demographics. There used to be for such a long time the Democratic stronghold in white working class voters that really propelled them to win, or propelled Obama to win in 2008 and 2012 throughout the Rust Belt. But what you're seeing now, or at least in 2016, you saw a dramatic shift to Trump up in the Rust Belt. But then you saw a huge dramatic shift towards Hillary Clinton in the Sun Belt that wasn't as much expected. You saw her outperform in Arizona. She outperformed in Georgia. She outperformed in Texas. Florida is a little bit off the mark, as you said, wacky, weird state. North Carolina is also in that regard, although North Carolina is still more of a wishy-washy state in that department. But definitely for Arizona, Texas, and Georgia, that is the Democratic electorate. Those states, racially, socially, in every regard, is the future of the Democratic Party, demographically speaking, and thus they're going to have to make significant gains there as soon as possible to offset the Republican gains up north in the Rust Belt.
And, as you were speaking, I was just thinking about, and you mentioned the Sun Belt. The Latino vote in this election just seems to be the wild card to me, because, there are reports going back to June and July of this year that showed that Biden was struggling with that demographic, and that Trump was actually the one benefiting from their support. And that has not changed, but, rather increased, and that's resulting in what we're seeing in Florida. I'm curious to see, whether you think this would continue to favor the GOP as we enter in the final phase of this election. It just seems as if, it seems to be going contrary to where the policies are in terms of, the strong stance against immigration reform. We couldn't even say, going back to the government shutdown of 2018, that we actually got a bill for the Latinos to point to and say, hey, we got actually some kind of legislation that allowed, my family or my brothers and sisters to come across easily. But it seems as if it seems to be, contrary to political gravity at this point. What are your takes on that demographic?
I guess, amongst the Hispanic voting population, they supported George Bush. And when we look at previous Republicans, I guess it's always been somewhat of a toss-up electorate. The Democrats have always had the advantage, almost always. But, entering into 2020, I think the reason why we're seeing a push for Trump is because of Biden as a candidate. I don't think that it's Trump. I mean, Trump is improving off, his numbers in 2016 by 2-3%. It's Biden that's dropping. I mean, in one of the polls, he dropped 11% off Hillary Clinton, but Trump went up 2%. So it's not that a lot of these voters are moving towards the GOP or, Trump in, wide sets, but it's more so that Biden has not offered, I think, the Hispanic community enough to say, you're solidly voting for me. And I think that's something that the Democratic Party has struggled with. And that's why, people were talking about, nominating a Hispanic VP or, someone that could hone in on that base. But I think that the Biden campaign was very focused, especially amidst the Black Lives Matter movement, getting a lot more attention than normal this election season, getting Kamala Harris chosen as VP. But I think that they're getting very late to the game in terms of reaching out to the Latino base. And I think Florida is an outlier because of the Cuban vote in Florida. I mean, that is a very solid Republican demographic. They voted for Trump in 2016 by 10%. So that was never supposed to go to Trump. But I think this tightening up amongst Latino voters for Biden is just the lack of outreach from his campaign. But honestly, once we move past this election, I don't think it's going to continue. I really think that the future of the Democratic Party, like Ryan said, lies in the Sun Belt. And those Hispanic voters are going to be crucial to turning Texas blue, to turning Arizona solid blue, moving Florida even further to the left and increasing its number of electoral votes. I mean, what we're seeing there is that the Latino base is going to be the future of the Democratic Party. And they are going to have a very large percent of the population. And I think by 2050, they're going to be comparable to white voters in terms of percent demographics. So,
I kind of want to pivot. Oh, go ahead, Ryan.
Oh, yeah. I was just going to make one very short point. Was just looking at it, like your point, Ethan, was Biden isn't necessarily, or Trump isn't necessarily gaining in the Hispanic vote, but Biden is losing in the vote. In 2012, Obama won 71% of the Latino vote. In 2016, Hillary won 66%, but Trump got the exact same amount of the Latino vote as Mitt Romney did in 2012. Just goes to show you that it's not like the Republicans are really making gains, but the Democrats are definitely losing sort of consistent support there.
Right. And to that point, Ryan, I was listening to a report where there was a Latino voter in Florida, I think Miami-Dade County, and they asked, why is it that you're supporting the president in this election? And they said, well, the Republicans reached out to me. They send me mail. They called my phone. They called my house. And so, to your point, outreach is key. And I kind of want to pivot now to the Senate, particularly in Kentucky. Mitch McConnell. After today, I said, well, how is Mitch McConnell going to go back home and sell to his folks that we couldn't get you another round of stimulus checks because we were not going to move on this $1.3 trillion proposal? How is it that, he has a chance against Amy McGray at this point with, not just the fact that he didn't have to get a bill today, but this is coming after months of there being no kinds of headway between Senate Democrats and Republicans for any kind of stimulus relief. How does this play into this, election for him?
Well, I think for sure that Mitch McConnell is going to be running under Trump in terms of his margin of victory. But I think it's almost assured just because of the state that he comes from. Because what we've seen is that Mitch McConnell has been in here for half a century. And, what he pretty much is going to be selling back to his people is that he's the majority leader. You kick me out, the GOP collapses. And I don't think they're worried too much about him, throwing in pork into their bills and getting stuff done in Kentucky. I think for a lot of those people, 34% of his constituents approve of him, meaning the remainder either don't have an opinion, and the vast majority of those people still don't like him. And when we're looking at the numbers against Amy McGrath, he's still polling very well. I mean, we're talking double-digit leads with someone who is the second most unpopular senator in the Senate. And I think it's just his power, him being the majority leader, his seniority in the Senate is what's driving his reelection campaign. I think it's much less for these people of Kentucky that, I'm actually getting stuff done, more so that they're not voting for a Democrat and they're not electing Amy McGrath to the Senate. And that's just a done deal. So.
Yeah, it's interesting expanding upon that. Amy McGrath has raised $46 million, which is $10 million more dollars than Mitch McConnell has. And you still see him polling 20 points ahead in some of these polls. And it just goes to show you that, all this outside fundraising is mostly coming out of state, obviously. But it as much as many, she can put out as many ads as she wants. But at the end of the day, Mitch McConnell represents the majority and the control of government of the Republican Party. And a lot of Republican voters in the state of Kentucky are probably going to feel like if they vote against him, they're voting against the Republican Party as a whole. So,
and the other factor to consider with this is the Bob Woodward Effect. His book that is going to be published on Tuesday, the 15th, Rage. I have read Fear, and I read it during my 1L year. Very, hard to put down book, but it seems like the Senate Republicans' reaction to the book and the fact that it seemed this, it's on audio tape where Trump actually admits to knowing about how deadly the virus is around the early parts of this year, February, I think early March, where he claimed, hey, this is more deadly than the flu, and then going back on live TV to say, hey, this is, he's purposely trying to downplay, how deadly this virus or pandemic is. Do you think that the fact that the Republicans have not taken a stance and say, hey, Mr. President, you should have come out earlier and, taken this more seriously. Do you think that their failure to do so would cause the voters to view them as more irresponsible, especially we're in this time where, there's so much stress, there's the social unrest that's going on. We have this pandemic that no one can seem to see the end of sight of. Do you think that would, play a toll into the, chances for not just Mitch McConnell, but, going down the line, Tom Tillis in North Carolina, in Maine, Susan Collins, Lisa Murkowski in Alaska, Sinema in Arizona, all of these folks are, on the chopping block basically. And there's a Lincoln ad that said, hey, know their names, and they have them out in bold. I thought that ad was, a very, one of the most powerful ads I think of this year. Do you think, that would have any kind of impact at all?
I mean, for me, it's sort of the question of, is this not the question we've been asking for basically the last 4 years, right? So it's like with everything that Trump does, you ask is this what's going to drive voters away from him? And it's every time the answer so far has been no. He has this solid base. He has this unconditional support among this certain demographic within the Republican Party. And I think that the key for Democrats and specifically Biden is to find the electorate within the Republican Party, or more in the moderate Republican Party, the Mitt Romney Republicans, the rhinos as they call them, or even just more conservative independents. Find those people that don't support Trump unconditionally and sort of paint Biden as this return to normalcy. It's like he's nowhere near as scary policy wise as Bernie Sanders would be to these kinds of voters. So it's just like, if you can find enough of these candidates overall and swing them into your column, you're going to have a very good chance of winning the electorate. Obviously, Trump is still going to have at least 40% approval in every poll, because there's just that unconditional support within his party that's just never going to go away, no matter what he does or what he says. And we've just seen that time and time again.
Before we bounce to you, Ryan, Ethan, if you could, before I bounce to you, Ethan, Ryan, if you could pull up your electoral map from the Senate, your Senate predictions. Or I'm sorry, maybe that was Ryan that had that map. I'm sorry. Ryan, Ethan, you had that map on the Senate predictions. I was wondering if you can pull that up. I thought it was really interesting, your take. And it seems as if, even though, you do concede some races to the GOP, it looks like we're headed for a blue Senate come January. Could you elaborate on that, Ethan?
So I think Ryan and I have roughly the same type of Senate map, just given that the races generally don't alter, don't change too much. But yeah, so we are on track to the Democrats retaking control of the Senate. It's been 6 years, and I think the Obama administration knows well enough that the Republican Party will block any and everything. And the Democratic Party definitely will too if Trump is to win and they take the Senate. But it is important to note that the Biden administration desperately needs a blue Senate, and that's what they're getting out of Maine. They're getting that out of North Carolina, and with the immediate concession of Alabama. I will say that Doug Jones, good guy, probably not going to win, and he's probably going to end up in the Biden administration if he does win. But if he does, Biden wins the election. But so yeah, looking at that Senate map,
yes, this is basically my basic Senate map with all the 4 states that I think are going to flip the control of the Senate in gray here: Montana, Iowa, North Carolina, and Maine. I don't know if Ethan agrees with me entirely about these 4 states being the ones that are specifically going to flip that race, but this is kind of how I have it, if you wanted to.
Yeah, and so if you notice, Kentucky is not considered one of those states. I do agree with this because Arizona, Colorado, pretty much gone for the GOP. Michigan might be somewhere that they will waste money in, but realistically it's gone. But for those 4 toss-up races, I will say that the Democratic Party has done so much in terms of fielding good candidates, phenomenal candidates in all 4 of these races. We're talking about popular governor,
Steve Bullock,
yeah, and then Cal Cunningham in North Carolina, very good candidate. Sarah Gideon, House Majority, Speaker of the House in Maine. We have really good candidates running in a lot of these races that the Democratic Party should be very happy about.
Yeah. If I had to say that out of all 4 of these states, I think the safest ones right now for the Democratic Party are definitely North Carolina and Maine. I think, honestly, their best candidate is Steve Bullock in Montana, just because of his favorability as incumbent governor there. But the issue with Montana is that out of all of these 4 states, it's by far the most partisan in presidential elections for the Republican Party. So it's like Montana, you're seeing Steve Daines actually start to pull ahead in the latest polls. In Iowa, it's been basically a toss-up the entire time. But I still kind of question that entire dynamic just because of how well Trump performed in 2016. But yeah, that's basically what I had for the Senate map.
If you can pull the map back up, because there was this the notion, you keep hearing it. I heard it in 2018, especially with their work in Texas against Ted Cruz, which was if you nationalize the race, that's going to be bad for Democrats.
Oh, yeah.
And so in Montana, I'm thinking back at all the YouTube ads that I've been seeing from Trump Jr., from Ted Cruz, from all kinds of Trump cabinet officials and senators saying, hey, support my friend Steve Daines. And they've nationalized this race, it seems. Now, I have not heard of any kinds of huge national Democratic endorsements for Steve Bullock as of yet. But I think that's on purpose. And I think they're trying to keep this a local election. North Carolina, when you said that, that's actually leaning more towards Democrats. North Carolina, my home state. And I was a little surprised because, I'm worried about not just the Senate, but I'm also worried about the governor race with Forrest, Dan Forrest.
Mhm.
Yep.
He made a lawsuit. Yeah, he filed a lawsuit against Governor Cooper for his ban on public gatherings, and this was during the outbreak and the national shutdown for COVID-19.
Right.
It was a political stunt, and it seems as if that's doing him well in polling. Do you think that continuing to make this more of a local race would actually be to the Democrats' detriment, especially when to your point, Ryan, I think that the partisanship from Montana is not just unique to Montana. It may be more intense there, but I think that because there's such this strong, desire to not see what they view as the establishment take back the White House or take back the Senate. Do you think that we're overestimating what it is that folks on the other side of the aisle are feeling, and so therefore we're in for a big polling shock again this year?
Well, I think it varies case by case, honestly, because in North Carolina, what we've seen, at least with Cal Cunningham, is him outperforming Biden on a polling level. I think, which means obviously if you don't want, on a sort of a basic level with the Republican electorate, there's the argument that maybe they feel more comfortable going out of the box of sorts and voting for a Democratic candidate for Senate than they do voting for Joe Biden for the presidency. And I think that could be the case of what you're seeing in polling and possibly on election day in North Carolina. If I'm not mistaken, did Deborah Ross in 2018 outperform Clinton, or in 2016?
I think she did.
Like narrowly.
Yeah, I don't know. We'll see what happens, but I think that's an early indication of Cal Cunningham maybe being more favorable than Joe Biden is in North Carolina, and possibly there's a chance that Joe Biden loses in North Carolina, but Cal Cunningham actually does win, which is interesting, which I think is definitely not the case in Montana, because in Montana, Trump is almost certain to win. Whether or not Steve Bullock can climb over that hump of, getting over that kind of boost that Steve Daines is going to get because Trump is on the ballot remains to be seen. But
yeah, I guess Steve Bullock he came over the hump in 2016, but he was also running for the governorship. Being governor is very different than legislating. There's a very popular governor in Massachusetts. My governor is, I believe, the most popular governor right now due to his COVID-19 handling. And he would not stand a chance to win the Senate race here.
Right.
But Steve Bullock is Montana's just a very weird electorate. The only solid race is the presidential race. The House race is competitive. The governor's race is competitive. No Republican has won the governor's race since 2000. So, for 16 years, the Democrats have held on to the governor's mansion in Montana. Now we're seeing a Senate race competitive that was characterized even by me as safe Republican before Steve Bullock dropped out. He was so strong about not considering running for Senate. And then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, we all knew it was happening, but out of nowhere, practically, he flip-flopped and said, I'm running. But Montana, very weird electorate. Yeah. Whatever they do, they vote, split ticket a lot of the time. So that's definitely going to be a target.
I think personally, Montana is going to be the most interesting state for the next decade, in my opinion, just because they're bound to gain an electoral vote and thus a congressional district after the 2020 census. And thus that congressional district, whether or not the Democrats maintain that governorship and what happens in the state house, obviously, we could see that congressional district become extremely competitive in years to come, which would mean that, say, Steve Bullock does win this Democratic race, you have two Democratic senators in Montana, John Tester and Steve Bullock. You have a Democratic governor, and yet they still vote for presidential or Republican presidential candidates. I don't know how long that's going to last, obviously, depending on what kind of favorability those candidates or those elected officials have there.
Yeah, and another thing that is weighing, I guess, is in the air for a lot of folks, is that Trump has set November 1st for the deadline to have a COVID-19 vaccine. Now, a lot of folks in the medical community have taken to the airwaves to say this is not realistic. Polio vaccine took I think about 70 years to come up with. Not to say that we're looking at 70 years, but usually when we're looking at medical improvements in the science, in the science world, is not going to be based on political deadlines. But let's just entertain the idea that there is a vaccine, not counting that there's no time to test it thoroughly and make sure that there's a selected class of people who go through this first. Do you think the fact that he can run on, hey, I've got something, I've been working on, or I've been, making headway in terms of leading the scientific community to get to this point. Do you think that, that would play any kind of role for his, not only his chances, but the chances of those coming on his coattails, the senators who are running for reelection, and even some key House races?
Well, you see, for Trump to, set a political deadline for the COVID-19 vaccine, I think is very irresponsible. It doesn't matter necessarily if you're supporting him or not. Setting a deadline for the scientific community to come up with something is very dangerous, because they very well could come up with something that doesn't work. And what we've seen from the administration is that they are very quick to endorse things that have very quick testing, things that aren't proven. But also, like if this vaccine gets released and he tells his core 40% of supporters, this will help you not get rid of coronavirus, I think that's definitely something they're going to believe, and they're going to 100% take that possibly, fake vaccine. But, I don't think Trump is going to win over any type of I wholeheartedly believe in science vote. A lot of what we've seen from Trump's base is that they put a lot of faith into him as a person. But what we've seen from the scientific community as a whole is that they are rebuking what he says, Democrats and Republicans alike, which is why it's so important when we see, doctors coming out that are Republican candidates for House races or Senate races. Some of them do support Trump's agenda, but a lot of them do recognize that, COVID-19 is a very real threat. These governors are right in, their closing of the states. And, for Trump to say there's no way he could spin this into saying he's the reason why there would be a COVID-19 vaccine. Even if there is one, it's still going to be very difficult. I mean, I made a map about even if he gets a vaccine produced, shipped out by November 1st, right before Election Day, the bump would only put him up to 16 electoral votes under where he was 4 years ago, just because he's already pushed away so many voters that, this vaccine, while being very important to a lot of Americans, still, won't be that breaking point, for not voting for Biden.
And out of curiosity, where did those 16 electoral votes come from mainly?
Michigan, one state.
Wow. And, it's interesting you say that, because Michigan seems to be a state that the Biden campaign seems to have a comfortable margin in right now. Not to say that they're taking it for granted, because they're very intent on not making the same mistake the Clinton campaign made in 2016. But, his trips out to Michigan, I know the Republicans have been making fun of Biden being in his basement. That seems to have been their new line, their go-to line. But now he's actually, these past 2 weeks after the convention, he's been making more of an intentional effort to come out and to campaign in person, of course, with the socially distanced regulations in place. It's a very interesting election this year, because I think this is one of the first times, there was an ad in 2016, but this time you have whole groups of traditional Republican voters, not just, going out and endorsing Biden, but putting their money where their mouth is and putting out ads. Bush 43 alumni, the Lincoln Project, and others. Has that shown to be, effective in terms of, Biden's chance at all? Because I'm thinking, in 2016, the assumption was, hey, traditional Republicans know that their party's being hijacked right now by someone who wasn't traditionally Republican. He actually donated to Democratic campaigns before he jumped into the race, and before he, was in the birther movement looking for President Obama's birth certificate. You don't want to get on board with this guy. Vote for Clinton, because you can imagine her as president, and then 4 years later, you can go ahead and oppose her. I'm worried that we're kind of overplaying our hand and overestimating the mindset of folks who are thinking, hey, I'm not traditionally in alignment with someone like Trump, so let me vote for someone who's not in alignment with my, political ideology, and then 4 years later, I can come back on to the Republican board again. Do you think that, we're overestimating that?
I think for me, it's if there's one argument to support that we're not overestimating, that is, again, pointing back to Hillary Clinton's unfavorability, and that a lot of those kind of Republicans in 2016 who were not in favor of Trump whatsoever, like they agree with maybe the majority of his policies, but they can't get past his character flaws, and they ended up voting third party, or even sucked it up and still ended up voting for Donald Trump, just because they can't have Hillary Clinton in the White House whatsoever. But we're not seeing that as being the case, at least thus far, with Joe Biden and his overall being more favorable than Hillary Clinton ever was. And I think he as a candidate is a lot more threatening, or a lot more unthreatening to that traditional Republican, anti-Trump Republican vote overall.
I honestly don't think it's going to make too much of a difference on the electoral college map. What's stopping a lot of Republicans from supporting Biden, I think, is the Supreme Court. And I think, when they're talking about the issues of abortion, and when you see Senator Tom Cotton, tweet out, it's time for Roe v. Wade to go, when he's being considered as, a replacement for someone that doesn't even need to be replaced at this point. I think the Republican Party really doesn't want to give up the idea of possibly losing the Supreme Court for 30 years, or, the possibility of just, being so far to the left in the White House, which is what I think, Biden did very well in this election season. The Bernie Sanders campaign, as much as they were inspirational to young voters and did arguably well in the Democratic primary, in the general election season, you always move to the center. And I think that's something that the Bernie campaign would not have done. But the Biden campaign has always been in the center. I mean, yes, they did give some concessions to the Warren campaign and to the Sanders campaign once they officially unified as the Democratic Party. But at the same time, Biden's campaign has always been about a sense of normalcy, returning back to what is normal. And all of those Republicans, John Kasich, Susan Molinari, all these people saying Biden is able to work across the aisle and he will work with Republicans, is going to convince some of them. But I don't think that, Biden won't win without the Republican vote. He could very well win off the independent vote and the Democratic vote. I think it's just an addition to his already growing, soon to be insurmountable lead. 55 days out, Trump doesn't seem to be any better than where he was 6 months ago.
This summer, the NBC put out a poll that said 56% of Americans actually believe that systemic racism exists in this country, while only 40% disagreed. Now, this was a huge shift from polling done in the past, 10 years prior, 20 years prior. So this seemed to be a significant turning point in terms of public opinion. And so pivoting to the Black Lives Matter movement, this year, usually when we have incidents where, there's an incident of police brutality caught on camera and it's going viral and it's getting a lot of headways in the media, there seems to be a period of protest, and then the conversation shifts to whatever the next shiny object in the room is. But in this year, you have incident after incident after incident, so that just as the seemingly period of protest seems to be dying down, as was the case at the end of this summer, another one comes up with Jacob Blake. The role that Black Lives Matter, the Black Lives Matter movement seems to have played in this election, is it significant? Or, the fact that NBC also reported that young people don't really turn out as they should. Therefore, you could have had a Sanders candidacy right now, but we have a Biden candidacy instead, because he was the preferred favorite among older voters, I believe, over the age of 30. Could we also overestimate the impact of Black Lives Matter, or has this movement actually not only changed the national conversation, but changed the what's politically feasible now in terms of not just the Democratic side, but the Republican side, pushing the needle on accepting the fact that there needs to be some kind of change in qualified immunity, some kind of change in neighborhood policing, some kind of reform as it relates to reforming U.S. Section 42 U.S. 1983, which provides this shield of this protective covering for officers to act and make mistakes while under state color.
So I guess for overestimating the Black Lives Matter movement in terms of support and what that will do for the Biden campaign, I don't think we're overestimating at all. I mean, you can't think about a time in this country that America was good when race relations was one of the top 3 issues that American voters were voting on. When we're talking about, people disagreeing wholeheartedly with a movement called Black Lives Matter, you have to realize that something has gone very wrong in our country, where something that is as simple as, Black people asking to not be killed by the police versus, a movement that was created in spite of that movement being, supported almost as much. And now I think that people are starting to realize the very real, reality of the election is that, you have someone who stands with protesters and you have someone who endorses, the shooting, if there was a better word for it, I would have used it, but literal shooting of protesters. And I think that, this election that a lot of people are starting to realize that, because every election, it's like, oh, this is the most important election of our lifetime. But this one really is. I mean, this one, we're talking about economic fallout, racial tensions, a global pandemic, on top of all these other things that are just happening, the women's rights movement over the past couple of years, gun control, all of these things culminating up to one election. So yeah, like, this is a very important election. I don't think we're overestimating really anything at this point.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's interesting to see from a polling perspective, specifically the support for Black Lives Matter. It's fluctuated up and down throughout this entire summer. It started out really low, of course, and then as we saw the George Floyd, the protests surrounding George Floyd, we saw the Black Lives Matter polling numbers skyrocket to unprecedented levels that we'd never seen before. And then we saw it slowly start to tail down, and then another event happened, and we saw it skyrocket again. And I think historically, we've never seen such consistent, I don't know how to put it, such national attention around this one issue that has sort of transcended age divide, as well as information divide. We're seeing young people obviously speaking about this issue a whole lot more than we've ever seen before. Which obviously, whether or not that translates towards in-person turnout or mail-in turnout, obviously in 2020, will remain to be seen. But we're actually starting to see this older voters come around to this issue at unprecedented levels, which is obviously a great thing to see. And I think it's really positive to see the messaging from the Biden campaign surrounding sort of this, like, I am on your side, while we have obviously the Trump campaign. And Mike Pence not even willing to say that Black Lives Matter, and we've seen all these things that are just, yeah.
And I'm just going to add, in juxtaposition to Trump being caught on camera telling Woodward, "Hey, you drunk the Kool-Aid," as it relates to accepting the fact that he has white privilege. So all of these factors coming into play, and I'm curious because I know the goal for GOP was to get to peel away 15% of African American men. According to like you guys polling data, have the Republicans been successful in their convention in making some kind of headway towards, it may not be 15%, but have they gotten any kinds of significant support from that demographic?
Yeah, I mean, in a lot of sort of demographic related polls, we've seen trends from Latinos, or the Latino vote and the African American vote, start to move a little bit towards Trump. Obviously not by great margins, but on the other hand, we've seen the white vote start to shift a little bit more towards Trump, or towards Biden. Sorry. So it's an interesting sort of dynamic, because we don't know at what rate these demographics are going to turn out this election, and so what kind of effect that is going to have. These incremental numbers, they could have a huge effect, and they could also have little to no effect whatsoever.
I think a lot of these polls are essentially lying with statistics. When we take a look at the voting blocks and you look at Black support for Biden, you see 81% of Black voters polled said, "I'm voting for Biden," and then 8% of them say, "I don't know who I'm voting for." When you take exit poll data of people literally walking out of the polling booth, they know who they voted for, and it's not like they're not voting. Comparing it to 2016 actual data is something that I think is just wrong to do. And I don't think that Biden's support is going to be, too different from Hillary Clinton's. That 8% or 9% of undecided voters now are likely to break the same way the, Black electorate has for the past couple of decades. They're going to split 90-10 in favor of the Democrats. And I think a lot of them may be on edge about voting for Biden right now, but when it really comes down to it, these people were on edge in 2016. The data indicated that Hillary Clinton may only receive 80% of the Black vote, which we all knew, didn't end up happening. So I think Biden's numbers, while he is decreasing based off Hillary Clinton's numbers, that's due to undecided voters, people who said they aren't voting. And then also, Trump is improving, but it's by 1-2%. I mean, yes, he's hit double digits, but that's from 8% up to 10%. And when Biden is dramatically shifting the electorate from, to white voters in favor of the Democrats, it's all going to be made up for on top of, everything else that's happening. So,
are there any key House races that you guys are looking at that, haven't gotten a lot of attention as you think they should have? I know I'm thinking about Maxine Waters' race in California against African-American guy, Republican Joe Collins. Of course, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez has rose to national prominence, and the Republicans put forward an African-American woman to run against her in, the Bronx area. A lot of times we can overlook the House races because they're every 2 years and there's so many of them. Are there any particular races that you guys are looking at that, are key?
I guess right now we're seeing a test for these AOC-like Republican candidates in a number of states where they're trying to combat the squad, where they're trying to defeat these Democrat incumbents in solid Democratic seats. And honestly, I think it's all just a waste of money. We have two of them here in Maryland. We have, I believe Kim Klacik is her name. She's running in Baltimore, and she's like, I'm doing this, whatever. I mean, I as someone who's like been to Baltimore pretty frequently, I can tell you she's not going to get more than 25% of the vote. She received 25% of the vote in the special election. So a lot of these, House races that I would say need some attention is just because of the fact that there's a lot of money being poured into it from the right, but it's going to surmount to absolutely nothing, literally absolutely nothing. And if there was one race I was to point out, would be Oklahoma's 5th district, just because that was safe Republican in 2018, but then the Democrats ended up winning it. But the other races that I actually take a close look at is just, how much money can be wasted on this one House district, because that's always fascinating to me.
And to your point, Kim Klacik is running against, a candidate in Kwasi Mfume, Dr. Kwasi Mfume, who has already served as the representative for that district. Not only that, but he was, the one who had pushed Elijah Cummings into the race. And so he therefore seems like the heir apparent for Elijah Cummings' seat. Ryan?
Yeah, I mean, from a House perspective, there's a lot of interesting House races in sort of big city, suburban areas, especially around Atlanta, Chicago, where, there are Democratic incumbents who won in 2018 and obviously a lot more vulnerable in 2020 with Trump on the ballot than they were in 2018. So I think I'm looking at a lot of races around there to see what happens. But yeah, I mean, it's hard to get so involved and so engrossed in these House races that is on a national scale, and obviously in Senate races, just because there, as you said, there's just so many, and there's one race isn't going to flip the control of government, so it's like, it is what it is.
Before I end tonight, I want to go ahead and ask you guys if you can show your maps of, if the election was held today, September 10th, 2020, what would the race look like from your perspective? And if you can go ahead and explain a little bit as to why. And then I want to go ahead and close off with, why, Ethan, you touched on it a little bit earlier. We hear this all the time, every 4 years, every 2 years. This election is the most important election of your lifetime. The stakes are so high. Why is it that this race is so different? We know that there's the pandemic. We know that there's social unrest. But there never seems to be an election where things are just, amazing, going swimmingly fine. This one, of course, this year, even folks are making memes about it. Folks are, laughing about how terrible 2020 seems to be in a number of different ways. But when we look at the political side of this year, I also want to get your perspective as to why it is we should take this year more seriously than we did in 2016. But of course, before that, your maps, please, and your predictions if the election was held today.
So I can share my screen really quickly and talk about where I think I'm going to fill it out live, I guess. All right, my screen should be up. All right, so this is the map that I was working on earlier. I'm not going to worry too much about margins. I'm just going to quickly fill in where I think all of the states will be voting. Yeah, so that should be it. 319 to 219. Yeah, so pretty much what I see happening in favor of the Biden campaign is the fact that, we're going to see increased Black turnout. And while that may not move states like Georgia and North Carolina and Ohio, over into the Democratic column, it surely will narrow them up. And what we've seen for Biden is that he's doing dramatically better across the entire Sun Belt. He's probably going to narrowly carry Florida. It'll be probably the closest state this election. Michigan was closest in 2016. And then Arizona, which, following the leaked comments, not leaked, I mean, Trump made these publicly 5 years ago about John McCain, but the McCain family is in firm opposition to, Trump's candidacy, firm support of Joe Biden. And McCain outperformed Trump in 2016 by 9%. They were both on the same ballot, but these Arizona voters really took a very strong liking to McCain. And what we're seeing on both the Senate level, the House level, and in the presidential level is that Arizona is getting bluer. And for the Rust Belt, I think they are just returning back to the blue wall scenario. Obama was a candidate that I, say made the Midwest seem a lot bluer because it never really was the blue wall. It just coincidentally had voted for the Democratic Party, but it's always been close. I mean, these were the closest states in 2000, 2004. And then Obama comes out of nowhere and sweeps them. And the Clinton campaign thinks, oh, we'll have the same effect. You won't. But, now the Biden campaign is starting to ramp up their efforts and trying to take back what Obama had previously. So that's really where I see this electoral map ending up if it was held today.
And Ryan, are you seeing the same thing? Are we looking at numbers that reflect 2012 more than 2016? Oh, you're on mute. I'm sorry.
Wait, Ryan, I think you're muted.
There we go. Okay, my bad. So basically, on this map here, you see the 6 states in gray are all states that Trump won in 2016, but Biden leads in polling. So if we're going off of a basic polling perspective, Joe Biden should win in all of these states. His lowest margin of lead right now, according to 538, is North Carolina, where I think he's up on average around 1.5 points. And all of these other states, he's up by around anywhere from 3 to 7 points. So if we're going off of a polling perspective, and if the election were held today, this would be the most likely electoral map. However, if we're talking about states that he's most realistically not going to win, that would definitely be North Carolina and Florida. And in which case, if he loses both North Carolina and Florida, then all of a sudden you see him at 290 to 248, and then things start to sort of spiral from there. Obviously, the nightmare scenario for the Democrats would be if polling is completely wrong, like to unprecedented levels, and he ends up the Democratic Party doesn't make the gains that they think they are in Arizona. Obviously, all of a sudden they lose in Arizona. And then all it really takes is for them to lose in one of these upper Rust Belt states. But basically what I've said sort of from the get-go is that the key for the Biden campaign is just to win in Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, because if they win in those 3 states, no matter what happens anywhere else, they win the Electoral College, and that's it. And those are 3 states that voted for Obama and Biden in 2008 and 2012, and there really shouldn't be any reason why Biden shouldn't win them again in 2020.
And this thought just came to me. Of course, we didn't talk about Russian and foreign interference, and of course, the DNI announced last week they're not going to make in-person briefings to Congress anymore pertaining to foreign intervention. Do you think that Russia's backing of Trump, or open support of Trump, and China's open support of Biden, do you think that those factors will play any kind of influence in states like you were pointing out? Because it seems like you both differ when it comes down to North Carolina and Florida in your predictions. Do you think that in those states where it can go one way or the other, especially, and there's so much electoral numbers attached to them, 270 is the magic number, do you think that foreign intervention would play any kinds of roles in altering the outcome of the election?
Well, for what we've seen from Russian interference is that they did make a move in 2016. Whether or not the Trump campaign was involved is a whole other question, but they definitely did things to persuade voters against Hillary Clinton and for Donald Trump. And, even for me personally, I remember my mom showing me a Facebook ad and she asked me, and she was like, does Hillary Clinton have Parkinson's disease? And I was like, what are you talking about? And then she shows me the thing, and it's just, one of those bots spamming under one of the posts, just things, no posts, no profile picture, but just on there. And it's very clear that these are not like real American citizens, and there's no reason for them to send out a 2-minute long ad talking about Hillary Clinton's, health concerns. And honestly, I think, that could have been a very big thing for the Trump campaign. As much as they're trying to make, Biden's supposed dementia a thing, it's not working. It's not resonating well with voters. I think they saw the same thing happen in 2016. And I think they're taking a page out of the Russian playbook and trying to, bring that back up, but it's just not working. When you say, Biden's hiding in his basement and then he's biking the next day, it just doesn't work for your message. So I think Russian and, Chinese interference could make an impact on the election. I don't think voters are going to vote differently because of certain countries seeming to be endorsing certain candidates, but definitely what they do behind the scenes, it could sway the American electorate in ways that we probably won't even be able to know until after the election.
Yeah, and to your point, before Ryan, you jump in, there was a report that showed that there were Russian bots under the guise of African Americans who were backing Trump. And, we were talking about their appeal to Black voters, particularly Black African American men. Ryan, your thoughts on that? And, do you see that, any kinds of foreign intervention in terms of, disguising themselves as American citizens, putting out different articles to support Trump or Biden or whoever, do you think that will play a role?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, there's no way of telling how much of a role it played in 2016. And obviously, with the election really being decided by 90,000 votes in 3 key states, for all we know, that really could have swung those 90,000 votes. And we know that a majority of this sort of interference comes through Facebook ads and Facebook posts. And unfortunately, a overwhelming majority of the adult population gets their news from Facebook. It's unfortunate, but that is the case. And so we have no idea what kind of impact that has on those kind of voters. But one thing that I wanted to add on top of Russian interference and just foreign interference in general having an impact, but one thing that we haven't talked about at all is the change in the sexism that we saw in 2016, not the case in 2020. To deny that to deny that sexism had no impact in the 2016 election is just completely ignorant, because everybody, obviously, we talked about a systematic racism in this country, but there's definitely a systematic form of sexism in this country that holds female politicians to a higher standard. And that's what we saw with all the rumors, all of the stigma surrounding Hillary Clinton being artificial, fake, too aggressive, all this. This is stuff that would never have been accused of a male candidate acting the same way. So I think personally that in itself had a much bigger impact than Russian interference or anything else.
Yeah, and to your point, even when Kamala Harris was announced as the vice presidential nominee, and I predicted this would happen, there was such a push to get a Black woman on the ticket by members of the media, by members of special interest groups. There was a letter sent by hundreds of women, I believe, hundreds of women in different interest groups, et cetera. And, there's also Black men who wrote, a letter. And my prediction was that once Kamala Harris is chosen, because all signs seem to point in that direction, all of a sudden they're going to go right back to, primary season, January 2019, and start picking apart her record as a prosecutor, picking apart negative things in her background that would give people a reason to, cast doubt upon her. And as I predicted, it came true. But, my argument is, as much as you can point, to unfavorable things in her record, you can also point to favorable things in her record when she also implemented a program that was aimed at getting young minority men off of the school to prison pipeline. So I wanted to get your thoughts on that, especially as we're getting closer to the debates. I think the first debate is the 23rd of this month. There's such anticipation surrounding the Pence Kamala Harris debate. So much, the bar has been set for Kamala Harris to outshine Mike Pence. And I think that, to a degree that's not fair. Even though she's shown herself to be a formidable prosecutor and to use those skills in the Senate chambers against Attorney General Barr, who's still licking his wounds. I think that, to try to set the bar so high, especially with so much criticism already swirling around her, not even just against Republicans, but people in the Democratic Party, people on Twitter, people on Facebook. I'm curious to see whether or not you think that same sexism will come into play to hurt the ticket in the fall.
You hear, Ryan?
All right. For me, what's interesting with the debates is I sort of have these two disagreements with the general public about how things are going to go, because obviously Kamala Harris is an extremely skilled debater, and there's no denying that. But to underestimate Mike Pence is a whole nother thing, because he did outdebate Tim Kaine in 2016, without a shadow of a doubt. Most polls had him outdebating Tim Kaine. He was a former radio host. He's sharp. He's quick. Obviously, there's questions about all kinds of things on it, policy-wise with Mike Pence, but to deny that he is a significantly better debater than Donald Trump is a whole nother thing. And then I think with the presidential debate, people are completely underestimating Joe Biden on just a level of, saying oh, obviously Donald Trump is just going to wipe the floor with Joe Biden. I don't think Joe Biden is a great debater whatsoever. I don't think anybody really does. But to say that Donald Trump is a good debater is just wrong, because he's not. I don't think either of them are really going to out-debate each other. I think it's ultimately going to come down to who makes less of a fool of themselves on national television. And so I think that's kind of the dynamic that I'm looking forward to seeing on a debate stage.
And before I go to you, I kind of, I had a conversation with someone about Biden's debating skills. And, I pointed back to 2008 when he was going against he was in the primary. Chris Dodd was in the primary. And it seemed like Biden and Chris Dodd seemed to win the debates, but they were not the players in that primary. They were not the key players. The key players were Obama, Hillary Clinton, and John Edwards. I'm sorry. And, another thing I think to consider is that the primary debate stage is a whole different animal from the general election debate stage, where you're not going to have an audience that can react and make noise and kind of like more of a sporting event. The general election debates is more academic, very quiet. You can't see the audience because it's black from the perspective of those on the stage. And it's a much more intimate environment, it feels, being that, of course, is one-on-one. And I think, I honestly think that Biden would surpass Trump, not only because I think he can keep up with him. I think he can, show us the Biden from the Paul Ryan debate in 2012. A lot of folks are, getting on his mental capacity and all that. But to me, Trump has not done anything to put confidence in his mental capacity, I think. Ethan?
So I think, Biden, I wouldn't say is like a great debater. But when he was one-on-one with Bernie Sanders, he very well could have thrown the Democratic primary at that point, and he held his ground perfectly. I think that Biden, when it counts, really makes his mark. And, he's really going to be able to, debate necessary. I think since the bar has been set so low for Biden that when he made that speech at the DNC, even Republicans were impressed because they had this vision of Biden in their head that Biden can't speak. And, when he makes 30 speeches and you take a 30-second tidbit with, he literally has a stutter and people attacking him for that and his mental capability, whatever it is, it doesn't work amongst voters. And what we're going to see at the debates is Biden's probably going to get a bump from them. Hillary Clinton won the debates, but that was expected. She was expected to have the experience. She was a presidential candidate 8 years prior. People knew that she was skilled in this environment. But for Trump to come in as an incumbent president 4 years later, experience is not the issue. But if he doesn't, improve off his 2016 marks and Biden does, literally just holds his ground, he will be proclaimed the winner because the Trump campaign is saying, Biden's not mentally fit to serve in office. But then if he holds his ground against an incumbent president, you can't really argue that anymore. And that argument falls apart 30 days before the election. And then for Kamala Harris, I'm very excited to see how she performs. Mike Pence might be smart, but he's also, I guess you could say, like conniving. A lot of what he does, he talks his way out of certain points that is very blatant. I mean, he has a very strong, anti-LGBT record, a very strong, record that just used again. If you're comparing Kamala Harris's record, she could bring up so many other things. He wasn't liked in Indiana. He brought down Donald Trump's numbers despite being the incumbent governor. There's a lot of things that you could, say, Pence did wrong. And if Pence brings up Kamala Harris's attorney general, record, you could also just bring up the fact that Donald Trump and his family members donated to her reelection campaign in 2014 for attorney general in California. And I think that's something that, she could literally just bring that up and then it would just be reran on the media. So a number of things, but I don't think the record is going to be an issue for Harris, more so for Pence this time around.
Last question of the night, of course. Why is this election, the most important election of our lifetimes? It seems, as you pointed out, Ryan, you laid it out a little bit briefly. There's so many factors in play in this election, but every 4 years we always hear a series of, a laundry list of issues of the day that cannot wait for the next election. We need to act on them now. So for folks who don't have confidence in the electoral system, for folks who may be a little bit cynical about the process, then they may say, hey, I'm not 100% on board with either of these candidates. Why should I, go through the mail-in ballot process in this election? Why can't I just sit this out? What is your message to them?
I think for me, it's sort of a fundamental look at your life and look around you. And do you like what you're seeing? It's like basically nobody alive today has gone through such a roller coaster of a year in just obviously with the pandemic, economic collapse, just all kinds of things that are just not normal, and these are all unprecedented times. And obviously people can be skeptical of all kinds of things surrounding the electoral process. But what it simply comes down to for me is obviously your opinions and your ideas don't really matter in this sense, but just look at your life and look at the people around you. Everybody has somebody that's been affected by the pandemic. Everybody's been affected by something that's happened economically, and it's like, do you care enough about those people, if not for your own life, to go out and make a change? It's like what Obama, or one thing that I've always respected so much about Barack Obama was his constant advocacy for voting, as the number one way to create change. It's like you can protest all you want, you can riot all you want, but ultimately what really makes change is putting people in office with the power to do so. And so that's what I would say to people.
Thanks, Ryan. Ethan?
So, like I mentioned earlier on, this election, we have so much happening. Usually elections are one issue elections. You're voting on the economy, or you're voting on, a war that's happening, or you're voting on something that, is a single issue campaign. That a lot of these previous presidential election campaigns, in comparison to the ones being ran right now, seem so inconsequential. And when we look at the fundraising numbers, you can see that there's a lot of money being spent in this race compared to previous presidential elections, even though, in a year like this, it shouldn't be holding too much weight. The only thing, all of these things hadn't happened over the past 4 years. Let's say Hillary Clinton was president, and we wouldn't be worried too much about, women's rights. We wouldn't be focused too much on climate change because there would be a Democrat in office. And when we're talking about Trump serving for the past 4 years, there's a number of things that he has done in his administration, that you would probably have to agree on both sides of the aisle, that have ended up turning out Democrats and, just overall make America look kind of negative. I mean, talking about climate change, which is a very real issue to people my age and older people as well, future generations are going to hurt because of what we're doing right now. It's not just, the Black Lives Matter movement right now. It's not just the global pandemic. The global pandemic likely will pass over, even though it will unfortunately take a lot more American lives than what we're seeing right now, just due to a number of things that have happened. But looking at climate change, looking at women's rights, looking at gay rights, looking at literally all of the things that have happened over the past 4 years that have been focused on gun control, these are things that need to be addressed now. And I think now more than ever, people need to vote. It's not a question of, will my life be fine after these next 4 years? It's also a question, will your children be fine? Will you be comfortable knowing that you didn't vote when, climate change is on the ballot, when all of these things are important for you to, vote for or vote against? You can't just sit this one out. I mean, maybe you can sit out a local mayor election because maybe you don't care. But this, is super important to people my age. And I don't think that 19% youth turnout in the Democratic primary is cutting it. So, yeah.
Yeah, I'm from California. I woke up at 10 a.m. yesterday to a sky that was entirely orange and completely dark. I had to turn on all of the lights in my entire house just to be just because of how insane the sky was. And I think just with everything regarding climate change, with all of these issues that we have to at least make some sort of progress towards it. We don't have to fix it in 1 day, 1 year, 10 years, 20 years, but at least begin the process towards it. And we're not seeing that happen right now with the current administration. And I think that's, if there's one sort of positive thing that's come out of with all of this unrest and all of this just ridiculousness throughout this entire year, is that I do think that younger people are more, if we don't see huge voter turnout among younger populations, then that's one thing. But I do think that we've seen a whole lot more activism from the younger populations than we ever have before. And that's a positive thing no matter what.
Thank you, guys. And I'm reminded of October 28th, 1980. Ronald Reagan looks into the camera after debating with Jimmy Carter and says, "Are you better off than you were 4 years ago?" That question is, I think, even more relevant today than it was in 1980. So much is more so much is more at stake this year than it was 40 years ago. And when we're looking at the election, we can often make this about, personalities against characters, as if we're watching a reality TV show. But, there's a reason why a lot of Republicans reluctantly went with Trump. And a lot of that reason went behind, the fact that he was going to line up the federal judges that they wanted on the bench, not just on the Supreme Court, but all the way down to the district court level. And they have put more conservative judges, I think, than in any other administration. That is a huge deal because these folks are up there for a lifetime appointment. So we cannot play checkers while the other side is playing chess. That's my appeal to the viewers. And this doesn't have to be another 2000. A lot of folks are saying, hey, they're lining up lawyers. Both sides are making sure that their arsenals are in place in case of another 2000 scenario where the electoral numbers are not matching the popular vote. I don't think it has to be that way. We've never had a situation where the popular vote and the Electoral College did not match up 2 consecutive elections. It happened for W in 2000, but it did not happen in 2004. And if you want to go back to 1876, it didn't happen again for Rutherford B. Hayes. So, there's so much on the ballot. But I want to thank you guys for joining me this evening. Ethan Kelly of Let's Talk Elections, Ryan Gest of Elections Predictions. These guys, I've been following you guys since 2017. Your predictions, your calculations are very on point, especially when I saw them play out during the 2018 midterms. So you are worth listening to. So I want to encourage my viewers to go ahead and go to YouTube, go to Instagram, look up Let's Talk Elections, look up Elections Predictions Official. You will not regret it. Subscribe. Great content that's put out on a daily basis, which I appreciate. And it gives your mind something to think about as we get closer and closer to November 3rd. So with that being said, I'm going to go ahead and close out. 55 days, guys. So much is so much is at stake. Guys, continue to do what you're doing. I'll be continuing to, look out for more content from you all. And if you're open to it, I'd love to have you back between now and November 3rd to have another conversation. But thank you guys so much for joining me. I'm going to go ahead.
Thank you.
Thank you.